Okay, I'm walking through the original entranceway to the motte, through the inner ditch and into the bailey area eventually. Go over here, I think, and get a good shot. You see that depression there now? That's probably the remains of a building. Here we are at Granard, Motte-and-Bailey Castle. Just very briefly, the castle was probably built in the 1190s. It had timber defences originally. It was built by an Anglo-Norman lord called Richard de Chute. It represents, if you like, the northwestern edge of Anglo-Norman settlement of the Lordship of Meath. Now, in terms of what exactly is a motte-and-bailey, the motte is actually the mound that we can see behind me. If you like, the mound is probably about 10 metres in height, and then the bailey is this sort of banked and ditched enclosure to the south of the motte. So that's the earthwork, and the bailey is defined by a ditch, an outer bank, and an outer ditch. This is a very complex earthwork, but again, the thing to remember is that the defences and buildings within it, certainly for the first 100 years or so, were built of timber or cob. You're going to ask, what is cob? Cob was kind of mud-built structures. But anyway, let's just talk a little bit about mottes. In terms of numbers, motte castles, it'll surprise people to know that the vast majority, when I say vast, the large majority of castles built by the Anglo-Normans in the late 12th and 13th century were actually motte-and-bailey castles. They were with timber defences. Stone castles or masonry castles, the popular perception is of course that castles were built of stone. Only about 25% of the castles built by the Anglo-Normans were built of masonry. The rest were built of timber, mostly motte or motte-and-bailey castles, mounds and these attached enclosures, or were ringworks, which are circular banked and ditched enclosures. There aren't that many ringworks in Ireland. In terms of numbers, we're talking about maybe 500 mottes. Now that figure is questioned, but the work of the Archaeological Survey of Ireland, who are part of the National Monument Service, have gone through the Irish countryside since the mid-80s, and that's about the figure that they've come up with in terms of numbers, about 500 mottes. In terms of their distribution, you can find mottes from Poland to Ireland, from Scandinavia down to northern Italy, but the main distribution is northwest Europe, including eastern and midland Ireland. Okay, in terms of County Longford, how many mottes are there? Well, we've recognised about 13. Most of them have the bailey feature like we have here at Granard, and it has been argued by various archaeologists and historical geographers that the bailey feature is both a feature of status, like how important the lord, the Anglo-Norman lord who built and owned the motte was, would have, a castle belonging to a greater lord, a more important lord would have a bailey, but also it's been noticed that the bailey feature occurs on the frontier of Anglo-Norman settlement as well. And at Granard we have both. We have a high-ranking Anglo-Norman lord in terms of the de Chute or Richard de Chute and his family, and also we are in a frontier area here, because the area to the regions to the west and north of us and northeast of us were dominated by Gaelic Irish princes and lords. And we do hear of, as we said in the historical section, we do hear of a lot of turbulence in the area. And I know some, bringing some colleagues from across Europe to see this motte, they are very impressed by the motte-and-bailey castle here at Granard. It's that much bigger than the average motte. So what else can we say? We've talked about numbers, distribution. What about siting? Well, what affected? Why did Richard de Chute in the 1190s or so decide to build a motte on this spot? Well, when we look around us, we can see that it's in a very prominent position. You can see literally for miles around, okay? Okay, we're now going to go to the summit of the motte, and you'll see what I mean by that commanding view, okay? So here we are on the summit of the motte, and you can see what sort of wide-ranging views. You can see all around us. We can see the Lough Crew cairns, sorry, the Lough Crew hills to our southeast. You can see Cavan and Bruce Hill to the northeast, sorry, to the northeast. You can see the Cuilcha Mountains on the Cavan, Fermanagh, Leitrim border to our north, and you can also see Roscommon and Slieve Bawn to the west. So it's fantastic. You literally see everywhere. You can just about make out Lough Derrivar down there, and Lough Kinnail just to our east. So you really get fantastic views right across the country. So at one level, this is a very impressive location. Literally, we're in a really fantastic position here, and that was obviously one of the reasons why Richard de Chute chose this location for his motte castle. But there's more to it than that, because when we look at the historical documents, we know that Granard was the centre of a pre-Norman Irish elite residence as well. And actually, when you look at the morphology of the motte-and-bailey, the bailey is crescentic in shape, with the motte lying on its northern side. And it seems to me that what happened here, and we can see the same thing at a number of other Longford motte-and-bailey castles, we seem to have a motte being placed on a pre-existing Irish ring fort. Okay, and then the ring fort is modified into a crescentic shaped bailey. So we have both morphological, archaeological and historical evidence to realise that de Chute placed his castle on top of a pre-existing centre, okay, a pre-existing fortification. And that's something to remember. The Anglo-Normans did not come into an empty landscape. They came into a landscape that had been settled, if you like, and farmed for millennia, and very often took over pre-existing Irish centres. So I think that's an important point. So that's the siting. So we've talked then about distribution, how many mottes there are, the fact that they're a type of castle we see right across Northern Europe in particular. We've talked about morphology. What else can we talk about? Well, we talk about function. What was the function of something like this? And in a way, we've hinted at it because we talked about the frontier nature of Anglo-Norman settlement in this area. There was a lot of turbulence, mainly from native Irish lords, upset, if you like, at the Anglo-Norman encroachment on their lands, but also often between the Anglo-Normans themselves. So at one level, one function, if you like, of a castle is obviously to protect its inhabitants against attack. That's one function. But we also know that they're homes. And not only are they the homes of the elite, along with their servants and retainers, so people lived here, and there would have been residential buildings of timber or cob in the bailey, or maybe even here on the motte summit. They were also centres of landed estates. So we have farm buildings in the vicinity. So very often we find that in places like this, that land would have been farmed in the vicinity for profit. And not only would we have had residential buildings either within the bailey, in the bailey, but we would also have had farm buildings, maybe in the bailey, but possibly somewhere in the vicinity. So we can define a castle then as the seriously defended residence of someone of lordly status. The tenants of the lord would have come for judgment here, and there probably was a courthouse, either a separate building or a building within a larger wooden structure. So there's a lot going on here in terms of function. Then in terms of things like, we talked a little bit about defence. Well, what can we say about the defences of a site like this? Well, we do know when we look at the earthworks here, I've already mentioned this is a very striking looking motte. I'd say across Europe the average size motte is 5 to 6 metres above natural ground level, the summit, the flat summit that we're on now. But here it's more, it's somewhere between 8 and 10 metres. So this is a big motte. And not only that, the bailey with its banks that define it, and the two ditches and second intervening bank. These are very impressive earthworks. And we know from excavation, from pictorial evidence, contemporary pictorial evidence, and also the historical sources, that timber castles were not the poor relation, if you like, of the castles, but actually had quite serious defences. We have to imagine things like timber towers, timber gatehouses, crenellated timber palisades with arrow loops in them. You know, much of what we find on a great masonry stone castle, we would also find in timber here. So the same defences. As I said, arrow loops, gatehouses, but also here on the top of the motte, around the edge of the motte, you would have had a palisade. I would think crenellated, you know, it had battlements, but also arrow loops, but maybe some great tower, timber tower, lying on the motte summit. And some of those towers were anything up to 3 stories in height. So you could imagine if we had a 3-story high timber tower here on this very, very significant motte, you'd see it for miles. And even now you can see the Granard motte, particularly to our south, east and west, for miles. There was a feeling that mottes only belonged to the initial period of Anglo-Norman conquest in Ireland, that somehow they're linked to the first 10, 20 years. But this is actually not the case. We have good historical and archaeological evidence for them continuing to be built into the early 13th century, but also we now have archaeological and historical evidence for them being built as late as the late 13th century, with mottes and baileys continuing to be occupied well into the 14th century. In other words, timber castles, motte-and-bailey castles, timber castles continue to be occupied and built well into the 13th century, and then seem to stop being used at some stage in the 14th century. Okay, so that's the kind of dating phase. Now, what else can we say? Let's talk about this particular motte. Well, we mentioned that it's a really spectacular example of a motte castle. This motte-and-bailey at Granard stands up to the best example right across Europe. And I might add, it's not the only Longford motte-and-bailey that is top class in terms of preservation and size. Lizard Dowlin as well is a top-rate motte-and-bailey. In fact, Lizard Dowlin, just near Longford town, owned by the Redditon family, has 2 baileys, which is again a relatively unique feature rather than just one. But anyway, this is a fantastic motte-and-bailey here at Granard, and the people of Granard are dead right to have opened an interpretive centre at the base of the hill down there a couple of years ago, entitled Knights and Conquests. And I believe they're also opening up an Anglo-Norman kind of rural borough village theme park beside it. So I would suggest people go and visit it. That would be a good thing. As I said, our feeling would be there is a historical reference to the castle being built here in 1199 by Richard de Chute. We know that Granard had a royal visit in 1210. I would suggest to you that King John either camped or stayed in this very fine, camped outside or stayed in this very fine motte-and-bailey. King John, I think I mentioned this the other day, King John being the villain in the Robin Hood films, I don't think he was as bad as he was made out to be, but he stayed here for a number of days in August 1210. And we hear of the motte-and-bailey castle here being taken into royal hands when Richard de Chute dies in 1211, and it's handed back to Richard's lord Walter de Lacy in 1215. Granard gets burned in 1272 and again in 1315, just reminding you of the turbulence in the area. But if you remember a few minutes ago, I mentioned something about farming and the fact that there was a landed estate, agricultural estate, attached on to this castle. But there was more to it than that, because very often Anglo-Norman lords, like the de Chutes, also founded villages and boroughs beside their motte castles. And the people who lived in these settlements rented land from the lord of the castle, in this case the Chute, and paid him rent and possibly carried out labour services for them on the land that they farmed directly, which is known as domain land. So we know here from the historical records that there was a borough somewhere in the vicinity of the motte castle. Now, for various reasons, it was suggested that that particular borough existed at Granard Kill to our west, about a kilometre, less than a kilometre to our west, because there are the remains of deserted village earthworks there. Well, we carried out excavations there in 2002, 2004, and really the earthworks appear to be late 16th, 17th century in date. There was no indication of a borough settlement there, an Anglo-Norman nucleated settlement. Village, in other words, a village, but with the status of a town. Furthermore, we wondered too if the village, the original borough, if you like, of Granard lay to the west of the motte, between here and Granard Kill. And the heritage officer, Longford heritage officer, gained funding, and we carried out geophysical survey, and no sign of the borough. Now, that is disappointing to some people, but and it is disappointing. Negative evidence is important too. And so it's telling us that that borough did not lie to the west, either at Granard Kill or between here, the motte, and Granard Kill. And it would seem to me the simplest answer is the best, and that is it's underneath the original town, if you like, borough founded by Richard de Chute, is actually underneath the present town of Granard. And that makes all the sense in the world, because that is the area around here that is protected from prevailing winds and weather and things like that. So what we would have expected then is a street running, if you like, eastwards or so, or east-northeastwards from the motte, from the base of the motte, with timber buildings and burgage plots on either side. In terms of the people who lived there, who were they, these burgesses? Now, it would seem to me that the majority of them would have been of English origin, and they would have been different, if you like, in ethnicity to the majority Irish population in the area. Okay, that's pretty clear. Okay, so we have a motte. We've talked about the motte-and-bailey. We've talked about the borough. As I said the other day, the Anglo-Normans, so Anglo-Norman colony in Longford comes under pressure from the late 13th century onwards, and in the early 14th century appears to collapse. well, what happens to their castles? What happens to the motte here at Granard? And it would seem to me, and the same happens at Lisardallen as well, the O'Farrells take over, the Gaelic Irish O'Farrells take over the castle. And at some stage in the 15th, 16th century, it seems to me that a tower house was built on the southeastern side of the motte slope. And this is not a stone behind me either, and this may be linked to that late medieval phase. So what it's mortared masonry. So what we seem to have here then is a timber motte-and-bailey castle built by the Anglo-Normans, and then maybe in the late 14th century, 15th, 16th century, but I would think late 14th or 15th century, the O'Farrells build a masonry tower house into the side of the motte. And we have a late 16th century map of Granard, a very late, early, sorry, when I say early, but a late 16th century map of Granard showing a masonry tower in that position. So what happens to the burgesses? You know, again, we would presume the English, ordinary English people who lived at the base of the motte in the 13th century in that borough. Well, it's likely from what we can see that they moved back into modern day Meath, Westmeath, maybe re-emigrated back to England. That would be the main theory. But there are little hints from the late 16th century that there are still English place names in the vicinity of Granard. And that sort of surprised me at the end of the day, that there were still English place names, despite the O'Farrells, the Gaelic Irish-speaking O'Farrells, basically taking over the place in the early to mid 14th century or so. And it may well be that some of them decided, well, a lord's a lord, whether they're Gaelic Irish or Anglo-Norman. I'll just pay rent to the new Irish lord. I'll change maybe my language. I mean, at this stage, I'm sure a lot of those burgesses would have been bilingual, intermarry with Irish people, but still keep the memory of those English place names alive to be recorded on early maps during the Tudor and Stuart conquest. So I'd like to think that at least some of the burgesses in the borough remained in place, if you like, in the later 14th, 15th, 16th century, intermarrying with local Irish and virtually becoming indistinguishable from them, and that some of their blood is still flowing in the veins of local people here. But who knows? I mean, you know, there may be ways of finding out through DNA. I'm DNA testing, but let's not get into that. Okay, what else? I mean, and I'll finish up now.
Yeah, okay.
What else can we say about the motte? Because it still dominates the town to this day, although it is a little bit blocked by trees and the very fine Roman Catholic Church. Again, you know, monuments like this still create an impression on the locality. For example, we know in 1798 that the motte was a central feature or a central part of the Battle of Granard during 1798. A lot of very heavy fighting went on around it. We have some folklore evidence that there may be a mass grave of rebel dead somewhere within the bailey, and also the gibbet, the gallows that was used to hang some of the rebels, lay at the base of the motte overlooking the town. So that motte was to play a very significant part in the 1798 Battle of Granard. And when we were here in 2002, 2004, a very old lady said that during the sacking of Granard by the Black and Tans in 1920, the townsfolk came up to the motte and watched the destruction being wrought by Crown forces on the town. And she said, I thought it was raining, but it was her mother's tears actually dropping on her face. So that was pretty powerful to hear that. So, you know, the motte has played an extraordinary part in Granard's history. We have a statue of St. Patrick on top as well, which I presume, I'm not quite sure when that statue was put up, maybe during the Eucharistic Congress, which was 1932. And, you know, that would be nice if that was actually restored and made to look a little bit better than it is, because it's suffering from weather damage. But it looks over the town. So that you know, the motte continues to have an effect upon the local landscape, and long may it be so.